Hello, everyone. I'm really glad to be at your service in a new episode of The Fact, the series that discuss international issues every week. Today, we have to talk about the new events that we have been witnessing these recent 2 weeks. And as you know, in Lebanon, there has been a protest, and it's been going on for 2 weeks at least. And today we have two respected guests that we would like to talk with them about the subject. We have Miss Randi Nord. She's political analyst and the founder of Geopolitical Alert from USA. And also we have Mr. Khaled Al-Kassimi. He is also international relations doctoral candidate and political analyst from Canada. I would like to welcome both of you to the program. And I would like to start with the first question, which is basically the most important and the most general question. And we're going to ask about the main reason behind, or reasons behind this whole protest that we have been witnessing in Lebanon. So, Miss Nord, what is your analysis about this event?
Hi. Well, thank you for having me on. Well, people are fed up. It's no secret that corruption is a big problem across all of Lebanon. Um, and it's impacted economic inequality and cost of living and everyone's kind of just the future of the country for a long time. People pay two electric bills because electricity goes out between 3 and 9 hours a day, depending on where you live. You pay two water bills, one for tap water for bathing, and then another delivery service for cooking and drinking. And then economic inequality is outrageous, and there's clear dividing lines. You can see which neighborhoods have money and which ones don't. People, even with good jobs, I know, only make about $3 an hour, which even on my slightly above US minimum wage, the cost of living in Lebanon is still just enough for me to get by on a US salary. So I can't imagine how it must be for people trying to support a family on their wages. And it's especially frustrating for young people who don't really see much of a future. A lot of people leave the country looking for better opportunities. And then, of course, that has an effect on the labor pool and jobs as well. Um, and basically, there's just a lot of poverty, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better because of the corruption. And as far back as June, I know the banks had started imposing withdrawal limits. I remember when I was there, I had trouble withdrawing enough money to pay for my rent in one sitting because you could only pull out so much money from one ATM. And not only that, but Lebanon's been pushed to its brink with unprecedented numbers of refugees after the war in Syria pushed, I think, 1.5 million people over. And a lot of people have returned home, but a lot of people have not. And that kind of goes on top of the Palestinian refugees who are already there. So that puts a further strain on the labor market, and a lot of refugees who don't live in the camps have kind of integrated into the city areas, and the cost of living has gone up. So there's a lot of young people too, I think, are frustrated with sectarian divides. But when the protests started, we saw a really strong class character that addressed a lot of these issues without any sectarian divisions really showing up. But that seems like it's changed over the past couple days. We've seen some provocateurs, and the AUB president, who serves as a beacon of U.S. colonialism there, the media is focusing on him, and the attention has really shifted away from the class conscious aspects to kind of what the liberal media would like to focus on and push towards. So, people are just basically fed up with corruption and how it affects their day-to-day life and their future, I think.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned so many issues and problems that Lebanon is witnessing right now. But as you know, recently the Lebanese government has issued and has given some new reformations, or at least reformation suggestions, in order to change a bit of the situation. But we don't know if the whole situation is going to happen, or are these reformations are going to be applied perfectly. So in general, do you think these kind of reformations should stop the whole thing? And so far, we have seen that it is not stopped. So I would like to know, first of all, about the reason of the lack of any kind of a change, or the lack of stoppage in these whole protests because of the reformations. And second of all, if these reformations are going to be anything special or not. So, Khaled, I would like to know your opinion about this point.
As Mrs. Randi was saying, in relation to the first question, we do know that there is a lot of economic problems in Lebanon, but I think the major issue right now is political. And the reason why I say this is because Lebanon is a post-colonial state. I think it's very important to remember that the French mandate only left not even 60 to 70 years ago. So the reason I mention this is because the political structure that was placed after the colonial powers left, especially the French, we're talking about 1943 specifically, the Constitution, which is not written, by the way, it's simply word of mouth. The way they placed it was, as Mrs. Nord was saying, was highly sectarian. So the reason I'm saying this is because we still suffer from the colonial governing structure, which was imposed by the French mandate. And when we look at, for instance, I'm referring specifically to the National Pact of 1943. So for instance, the National Pact would say something like, the president has to be a Maronite, the prime minister has to be Sunni, the government speaker, the parliament speaker has to be Shiite. The result of such a sectarian constitution resulted, as we all know, in the 1975 Civil War, which lasted until 1990, right? And since the 1990s, we've had former warlords, and I can be specific if you'd like. We have individuals from the Phalangist Party, the Lebanese forces, and this is not strictly from the Christian side. There's also from the Muslim side who were involved in corruption during the Civil War. So what we have was kind of this transfer from the barracks into the parliament that occurred, right? So that transfer, there was never a reconciliation phase. So if we look at South Africa after the Civil War and apartheid, there was some sort of reconciliation where people went to jail, some people got executed, some people were exiled, some people just left the country in general. That never occurred in Lebanon, right? And the reason why there's so much turmoil right now, as Mrs. Randi Nord is saying, from the economic perspective, is because the political structure of Lebanon is still highly colonial. Colonial in the sense that economics becomes sectarian, and that's precisely the neoliberal problem that we have in Lebanon. All over the world, there's a neoliberal economic problem, but the issue in Lebanon is that neoliberalism is compiled with a sectarian character. So when an economic policy doesn't go through, instead of people saying, let's go to the parliament and negotiate this, people end up blaming specific religions for the problems. And that creates a rift within society. And as Mrs. Nord was saying, instead of people looking at it from a class perspective, kind of a class struggle issue, they look at it from a religious perspective. So this kind of prolongs actually rectifying the problem. So that was kind of in relation to the first question, kind of in just adding on to it. But in relation to your second point, which is kind of linked to the first question, the reforms that were put in place by our Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri, which were, by the way, agreed by Gibran Bassil and were agreed upon also by Sayed Hassan Nasrullah. So the three major, if you want to call them influential leaders in Lebanon, they both agreed on these clauses or articles that need to be put in place. So, for instance, one of them would be to remove bank secrecy of specific ministers or individuals who are known to be corrupt or have benefited from the 1990s economic reforms or the modality that's been adopted. The reforms are excellent. Okay, like any jurist, and I can name you a few jurists and economists who actually backed these reforms. Now the issue is the implementation of these reforms are volatile and some people are saying impossible unless we change the structure or we reshuffle the ministers in the government, because there are ministers who have a portfolio of corruption and they wouldn't want to implement these reforms precisely because, one, it exposes them, and two, it pretty much removes the economic power that they used to have since the colonial days until this day. So we have individuals like Wali Jumblat, Amin al-Jumail, Samir Jaja. So individuals who don't want these reforms to occur are specifically individuals who, one, were either involved in the Lebanese civil war or still benefit from the post-civil war structure that was put in place to benefit their own, if you'd like, oligarchical or petty bourgeois interests.
In here, because both of you mentioned these sectarian issue that is going on in Lebanon, it is also being the subject of some of these protests right now. But recently, we have seen Sayed Hassan Nasrullah just referring to all these protests, and at the same time, he supported the people and their right to actually protest these problems, and also he supported the government. So I would like to know about your opinion about this approach that Sayed Hassan Nasrullah has chosen in order to control the situation in Lebanon. So, Ms. Nord, what is your analysis about the general approach that Sayed Hassan has chosen toward both sides in these protests?
Well, going back to the election, I believe it was last year when it took them 9 months, I believe, to form a government. The resistance bloc parties performed very well in the election. So they have a large stake in the current government. And unfortunately, obviously, the government now has inherited the problems from the post-Civil War and up until today that we see now. I know a lot of people were very excited that at first he was very supportive of the protesters, and then I've seen a lot of people kind of disappointed, asking them to vacate the streets, and but they did trust his judgment there. And on one hand, they have put forth this good reform package, and if the protesters that are in the streets now are continuously calling for the entire government to step down and resign, and then we have to ask, well, what would come next after that? We would have another power vacuum, and then, well, what would happen? Would there be elections again, and the same types of people would just fill these slots? If so, so if the government was to collapse, we have to ask what would happen next. And the sectarian divides aren't going to go away, and the people with the money and the power aren't going to go away. So that doesn't really fix the structural issues. We've already seen how when civil unrest and power vacuums are created, outside powers like the US and Israel and the Saudis capitalize on this for their own interests. And the Saudis and the Qataris have a lot of investment in Lebanon. So I couldn't see a scenario where they wouldn't want to capitalize on that should the government collapse, and it's kind of left for that. So yeah, the civil war has lasted 15 years, so it doesn't seem like it's in anyone's best interest to keep calling for the fall of the government. So it makes sense to me that Sayed Hassan would kind of say, okay, it's time to hold back a bit. They could be preparing to blame some kind of attack on civilians on us, and that would lead to escalation of outside involvement. Because Lebanon doesn't exist in a vacuum. We have Israel to the south and Syria, which is just winding down. So, of course, there's lots of factors at play here.
Okay, your explanation actually gives us this next question, which is related to your explanation, because you also mentioned Saudis, and we are interested to know about this social media movement that recently Saudis and Zionists are actually initiating in order to encourage people to come more to the protest and somehow continue their movements in order to make the government collapse. But at the same time, we see that there are some kind of violence movements in some parts of these protests. And I would like to know if these encouragements or encouraging from these, I can say, cyber Saudis or cyber Zionists, and also these violences in the protests, do you think these two are connected somehow or not? So, Khaled, what is your analysis about this point?
If we look at the first speech of Sayed Hassan Nasrullah, we realize that this was in the first week, few days of the protests or the agitations. He was, fully sided with the protesters, fully sided with their demands, to end corruption, to bring people who are corrupted to justice, and for the record, Hezbollah and the Free Patriotic Movement, which is headed by Gibran Bassil, who has the most members in parliament, as Mrs. Nord was saying. Their parties have been fully involved in trying to tackle and implement reforms for years, right? Now, the interesting thing, and because time is not of the essence here, as you said, this is entering the second week. With Sayed Hassan Nasrullah's second speech, we notice that he, stated that he wants all of individuals who are part of Hezbollah that are in the streets to get out of the streets. And he gave a reason for that. And this reason is precisely related to your question. And he is not the only political individual to say this. You have economists such as Hassan Khalil. We have economists such as Hassan Al-Alid. We have the deputy parliament speaker such as Eli Firizli. We have individuals like Najah Wakim. The reason why I'm saying all these names is because from every religion, every sect, everybody has now emphasized that this is no longer an organic protest. And what I mean by organic, I mean it is no longer simply people who are genuinely taking the streets. You now have civil society groups. To be specific, we're looking at specific society groups such as Sab'a, in Arabic means the party of seven. You have Beirut Medinati, which in English means, is translated to Beirut is my city. you have National Endowment of Democracy, you have Carnegie, you have all these specific think tanks and organizations which Hassan Nasrallah one didn't say them by name, by the way, in his speech. However, he alluded to a fifth column within these protests, and not to just blame Western think tanks, because there are again local parties which, because they're against the resistance bloc, as Mrs. Nord was saying, or are against our current government reopening relations with Syria, right? We can see how they're capitalizing on this protests by collaborating with these civil society groups who adhere to this liberal capitalist idea of development, right? So we're looking at individuals like Samir Jaja, Amin Ismail. They're the ones who are asking for the full resignation of all ministers. But this only leads to a political vacuum and then chaos, which they hope would occur. Thus, they can reshuffle the government to fit their own political perspectives, which is Syria as an enemy, Bashar al-Assad is an enemy. Why not have neoliberal politics? Why not have privatization? So the reason I'm saying all of this is because Sayed Hassan Nasrullah and other politicians have emphasized that this is no longer simply an organic protest, right? Yes, the demands of their people are just and they're noteworthy. However, we can no longer just simply say that while the government gave you an idea of reforms that they're thinking about, you can't simply say that all of them means all of them, because that's the slogan being said, kullon yani kullon, which means all of them means all of them. All of them means all of them means political vacuum, and that means that you think that everybody in the government is corrupt. That is categorically false. Not everybody in the Lebanese government is corrupt, right? There are some people who have zero corruption portfolios and have never been involved in this. So we can see how civil society groups and specific colonial collaborators who have benefited from this neoliberal politics are now saying we want the whole government to resign, precisely because they're not okay with the governing structure right now that's in the parliament that has majority, which is willing to reopen relations with Syria, is very adamant in having a resistance group in Lebanon, not simply Hezbollah, the communists, the SSNP, the PFLP are huge resistance blocs who have explicitly stated that, hey, we have enough intellectuals, political scientists, lawyers in Lebanon that can take us from this scenario that we're in into a better scenario. Now, the problem is that you have people, as I mentioned before, who don't want this transition to take place, right? Because that directly hinders their own interest and their own political affiliations. So just a last point. So for instance, Samir Jaja, whose party is a fascistic party, according to Pierre Abu Saab, it's a right-wing Christian party. They are on the record, WikiLeaks even reported this, they received donations from Saudi Arabia. He resigned in the first 48 hours from the protests, making it seem like, he's, prioritizing the well-being of the people. And maybe he is, but the history that he's been involved in and his reputation isn't so angelic, right? So it makes me wonder why Samir Jaja would want to resign. That's to further pressure the government, right? And to further show his international donors, Saudi, the United States, that he's willing to follow and not undermine their own political aspirations that they would want to have in the region.
Okay, this question that I'm going to ask is somehow the question that both of you has explained somehow about it. But I would like to know more about the details or more about your analysis concerning this last warning that Sayed Hassan has given to all people of Lebanon and also the government about the complex plan that is going on in Lebanon in order to make a civil war in this country. And I would like to know about the people or the countries or the entities who are somehow behind this plan. Who do you think is going to apply and implement these plans in Lebanon? So, Ms. Nord, what is your analysis about this point?
Back in April, a leaked document surfaced when President Aoun was meeting with Mike Pompeo. Someone presented him a document, reportedly, as far as I know, this has not been confirmed, detailing plans between the US and the Israelis to kind of foment a civil war by heightening sectarian divides and attempting to kind of splinter the Lebanese security forces, because they acknowledged that since the Lebanese army is accurately as everyone from civil society and the population that belongs to the army, there's it's not a homogenous group. So it said they had plans to kind of focus on investing in the Lebanese security forces, which would be used, and that there was a possibility that the Israelis would carry out attacks on civilians, which obviously would be blamed on Hezbollah. So I mean, obviously the US and the Israelis have kind of been salivating over some kind of opportunity to blame some kind of violence and unrest on Hezbollah in Lebanon, so they can kind of start a feud there. So as Syria kind of winds down and the Saudis face defeat in Yemen, I know Lebanon kind of seems like the most likely next target for them. But at the same time, they'll obviously need US support. So that kind of begs the question of, would the US get involved personally? And at this point, that doesn't seem likely, because we are in an election season right now, and Trump's dealing with an impeachment inquiry. He just pulled that big PR move with Baghdadi, which everyone knows that's just nonsense, because it's just become a running joke over the past 3 years that someone kills him every couple months. So, I mean, that was kind of obviously a move out of desperation. So I don't think Washington is really interested in entering another losing war right now. He already was very embarrassed by Bolton kind of leading him into Venezuela, and it kind of backfired in his face. He didn't realize that Maduro had the support that he did. So that was very embarrassing for him. So I don't really think the United States is interested in entering a war they're not convinced they could win, especially at this time with the election going on. But like Dr. Kassimi said, there's groups in Lebanon who would have interests in controlling power should a vacuum erupt, and the neoliberals like the National Endowment for Democracy and those kind of think tanks, who obviously would love to have a kind of technocratic neoliberal privatize everything government in place, which they would really love to kind of prop up and show as their example to the right way to kind of carry out these closed door interventions and things like that. So I do think a lot of different groups have plans to kind of create some kind of civil war, but the question, I guess, would be who would actually go through with it, and to what extent would this break out?
Well, for the last question, I would like to add the subject of Iraq. And as you know, at the same time, we have these protests in Iraq since few weeks. And I would like to know if there is any kind of, I can say, central coordination or control behind these both or hold these protests in the region. Do you think the protests in Lebanon or in Iraq are somehow related to each other or controlled by same powers, or it is just by accident that we are witnessing these protests at the same time? So, Khaled, what is your point or your analysis about this subject?
So, in this idea of civil war, we can honestly see who wants a civil war by looking at where these former politicians or current politicians are going to speak. So, if we look at, for instance, Samir Jaja, Amin Jmail, Walid Jumblat, where are they heading? They're heading to communication centers such as France 24, Al Arabiya, Al Jazeera. And if you look at the discourse that they're engaging in, it's Hezbollah's the problem. He needs to hand in his weapons. The current government by Michel Aoun needs to resign. So they're intentionally or unintentionally creating fertile ground for a civil war, right? Because as we all know, the problem is not Hezbollah. Right. And if you look at the New York Times, the foreign policy, their articles are literally emphasizing the issue of Hezbollah being a problem and the Free Patriotic Movement, Jabran Basir and Michel Aoun. Right. So it's interesting to notice that we're literally going back to the same narrative 10, 15 years ago. They take any opportunity to actually kind of re-solidify their sectarian base by using sectarian narratives, right? Hezbollah is a proxy for Iran. They actually don't want to fight Palestine. All of these incompetent, inaccurate statements, right? So that was just kind of one point in relation to that question. In relation to Iraq, now it's not surprising that, and this is not to sound conspiratorial, but in the past month and a half, you had Egypt, Iraq, Syria, all claiming that they want to reopen relations with Syria, right? And they've all explicitly said at the Arab League that, well, Lebanon and Algeria more explicitly than Egypt, that they would like to see Syria back in the Arab League. As political scientists and as political analysts, we cannot remove geostrategy from our discussion, right? Every country who is now thinking of reopening relations with Syria, it is going to face geostrategic repercussions. Now, I'm not saying that the protests occurred because Lebanon wants to go back and open relations with Syria. However, I am saying that the protests are being used as a tool to force Lebanon to adopt or forget specific policies that they would have wanted to adopt. And this is when you see civil societies coming in. This is when you see former politicians trying to push a specific narrative, right? That maybe Lebanon shouldn't go to Syria because, don't you remember, Hezbollah killed the prime minister, which, by the way, there's no proof for that, right? Even the Lahai tribunal didn't come up with anything, right? So it's all these sectarian based narratives which kind of get resurrected in a moment where individuals think that they can bank on these specific narratives. So in relation to Iraq, again, is a post-war country. Since 2003, the individuals who have taken power in Iraq and who have literally divided the country based on sectarian policies, right? For instance, like the Dawa Party or Nur al-Maliki, for instance, is a corrupt individual, right? Just like there's corrupt individuals in Lebanon, and they've advanced specific policies that have not seen the wealth of, for instance, oil revenues going to the people. It's gone to specific classes, petty bourgeois classes, who have benefited from, Iraq being in a state of chaos, right? So Iraq, similar to Lebanon, post-war, so Lebanon post-1990, Iraq post-2003, there hasn't people in government have taken advantage of the political chaos that has erupted and have transformed it into a sectarian structural political problem. And that's the similarities between, the demands of the Iraqi people and the Lebanese people, which are both Arab, right, first and foremost. But it's we can't ignore the fact that, as Mrs. Nord was saying, because Iraq reopened relations with Syria, opening Abu Kamal, the transit route, because Gibran Bassil and Michel Aoun have explicitly stated before the protests started, for those who don't remember, that they want to reopen relations with Syria. Gibran Bassil literally said 3 weeks ago, before any of this started, that he's going to be attending Syria, right? Michel Aoun said the same thing at the United Nations. Not that he's going to go to Syria, but that he will do anything in his power to help Lebanon's economy. We all know that Lebanon's economy is to be highly dependent on Syria, because that opens the route for goods to go from Syria into Iraq from Lebanon, right? So all of that is now being undermined, right, by these protesters, becoming politicized in specific circles in the United States, in Israel, with these civil society groups. So there are a lot of similarities between Iraq and Lebanon. The major one is that there still is not a government that is actually serving the people as a whole. It's serving only its own bourgeois interests, right? Which is obviously being at the expense of the whole nation as a whole. So,
thank you for your explanation. Here I have done with the questions, and I would like to know, in case you want to add anything concerning the questions, or anything that you want to add other than the subjects that we have talked so far. So, starting with Ms. Nord, in case you want to complete any part of your answers, or you want to add anything, I would be more than happy to hear it.
Sure. Just kind of briefly, kind of about the last question there. Um, my my phrase with most things is kind of, why let a good tragedy go to waste? Um, I feel like the outside powers, like the United States, are always kind of working 2 steps behind and not 2 steps ahead of any kind of coordination. So I think it's more along their line to kind of capitalize on any kind of grassroots movement and pull it in their favor. And in that respect, one of the benefits that Lebanon has right now is that there is no U.S. base there. So the U.S. involvement and interests look slightly different. They would be more capital driven and soft power, as opposed to in Iraq, the United States is still very heavily involved with a military occupation, and they're desperately clinging to their last bit of influence there. They had an excuse to stay there when ISIS was still a threat, but after the fall, after liberating Mosul from ISIS, when they lost that and ISIS was pushed out, the United States now has to kind of still create excuses to stay. And in Iraq, they would like to continue occupying the oil fields, obviously, and maintaining a base to where they can easily flow in and out of Syria, and right, essentially throughout the whole region there. That's kind of their gateway right now. U.S. perspective to kind of directly coordinate, because it's much easier for them to shift the blame on Iran, and because we're seeing a lot of anti-Iran propaganda coming out of the photos and things, and so it's really easy for the United States to shift the blame onto someone else, so that the people don't turn their focus onto the United States, who is directly occupying their land and natural resources.
Thank you, Ms. Nord. Mr. Al-Kassimi, in case you want to add anything, I will be at your service.
Thank you. Yeah, just last words, and this actually goes pretty much as an Arab myself who is born in France, but my parents are Lebanese, right? So I'm Arab, Lebanese. But the reason why I'm saying this is because it doesn't matter where a person is born, it doesn't matter if your parents are from that region or not. I just would like people to not be taken by these ideas of. I was reading an article in Foreign Policy in New York Times saying, the beauty of these agitations is that they're leaderless, they're spontaneous, people are reborn, right? These are very Orientalist, culturally relativist statements. What do you mean we're being reborn? We weren't dead or childs before that. These weren't spontaneous. These protests were a result of 30 to 40 years of economic policies which are corrupt. So it's not spontaneous in the sense that we didn't see it coming. We actually did see it coming, right? And this idea of leaderless, there's never been a revolution that succeeded being leaderless, right? Unless you want to take over and hijack the revolution, yes, you'll push the narrative that it's amazing that this revolution is leaderless. The individuals who are pushing this narrative that the revolution in Lebanon is leaderless and it's great because it's leaderless, they're unintentionally or intentionally trying to say that we're not happy with the government that is anti-imperial, anti-corruption, anti-neoliberal, pro-resistance. That's really what they're saying, because they hope that in this leaderless revolution, they can create this new Lebanon, quote unquote Washington Post, right? They want to create this new Lebanon, which is actually vacant of these supposedly like passe Cold War narratives of, you guys still talk about imperialism, you guys still talk about Israel being a Zionist entity. This new Lebanon is not going to happen, right? The people in Lebanon are highly politically conscious, right? Yes, there is sectarianism. However, people know who their enemies are, right? The last time Lebanon has attempted to have a peace treaty with Israel was in 1983. And believe it or not, the same people who pushed that treaty, who are from the Kataib party, the Phalangist, are the same ones right now saying that we want full resignation of the government. And they're the ones aligning with the United States, France, and the Lebanese forces run by Samir Jaja. So it's interesting to note that don't fall prey to these narratives that spontaneity, leaderless is actually a good thing. It's not. As Mrs. Nord told us, this will only lead to a political vacuum and political chaos. And if the Arab Spring taught us anything, is that the destruction of the bureaucratic state, just like it happened in Iraq and in Libya, destroying the bureaucratic state, the ministries, the armies, etc., will only lead to what neoconservatives call creative anarchy or constructive chaos. So instead of you filling the political vacuum, you actually mitigate the chaos that arises from this political vacuum instead of you eliminating the chaos or the corruption entirely. So that was just kind of a final point for our viewers to not be euphoric about spontaneity and leaderless. No revolution ever succeeds without a project or a manifesto.
Thank you again for both of you for your brilliant and super informative explanations. Myself, I learned a lot in this episode, so thank you again. And I would like to also invite our viewers and listeners to follow our YouTube channel and other social media web pages concerning our program. Thank you again, everyone, and hope to see you again on this program. Goodbye.